And welcome to Aging Today. We are the podcast where together we explore the many options to aging on your terms. You can find Aging Today and our 4 years of past programs on our website. All you got to do is go to www.agingtoday.us. And then you can also follow us on your favorite podcast channels such as Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcast, iHeart, Spreaker, and many others. Finally, I want to hear from all of you, our listeners, our faithful listeners over the past 4 years. I've been getting lots of emails, and I just wanted to say thank you for reaching out. We want to address all of your questions. We want to, and especially those questions related to future shows. So if you have ideas for shows that would be interesting to you, you've always wanted to have an expert on the field to address those nagging aging questions, reach out to us, let us know, and we'll make it happen. All you have to do is contact me, your host, Mark Turnbull, at mark@agingtoday.us. That is mark@agingtoday.us. Well, today's program I'm very, very excited about. This is breaking new ground for Aging Today. We've not had any conversation about this most important topic of the day, and that is in regards to sex. And to address that topic of our sexuality as human beings, our good friend from a past show that we've had on, and I so enjoyed her company and her insight, her wisdom, is Dr. Katherine Esty. She's an author, a speaker, a psychotherapist, and she's here to tell us and talk, quite frankly, about sex. Dr. Esty, and we're going to call you Katherine. Is that okay?
That's great. That'll make me feel relaxed and comfortable, too.
All right. Katherine, welcome to Aging Today.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm delighted to talk about today's topic, sex and the senior, because I think it's something that has too long been a taboo topic, and that sex is a very important topic for us to think about and talk about, and especially in how it relates to the whole topic of aging well.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, it's one of those things. I remember when I was in my college days and I was attending church services, and an older pastor got up into the pulpit and he looked down upon his congregation and he said, you know, it's interesting. I was asked the question, when do you stop having sex? And the pastor glared over the pulpit and he said, my answer to that question was, I don't know, but it's somewhere past 85. And he was 85. So I think it's one of those topics that we often, associate with young people, and we can't imagine, Katherine, that, people over 65 or over 85 are sexually active. And where does that taboo come from?
So I want to go back for just a minute to a little more about my own background, Mark, before we go on to our culture. I want to say, because how I've learned to talk about this topic really is professionally comes from my 40 years as a practicing psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. And much of my practice has been couple counseling. And so, I've had couples in their 20s and couples couples in their 80s. So I have had a listening ear to the struggles and happiness of couples in terms of this topic. And I want to just tell you that on the personal side, I was married for 59 years to a marriage that was mostly always happy, but it had its ups and downs, as marriages do. Mm-hmm. In 2015, I became a widow, so I was alone for 4 years. But recently, in the last 2 years, I have a new relationship, a new love, and during the pandemic, we moved in together. And I'm a little older than the person you cited in that joke, Mark. He was 85, but my perspective comes from someone. It's a long perspective, but because I can tell the audience that I can talk about sex and seniors because I definitely am senior, very senior. I'm 87. So now back to your question.
Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah.
And a good long life, and you're living life with the zest and the zeal that I think we all desire for our own lives.
So you'd asked me, how did we get where it was so hard to talk about sex? And I think that comes from our Puritan heritage that seemed where people just didn't ever mention sex. I can't tell you how many people in all my therapy sessions that their mothers never told their daughters anything about their periods, about sex, and so people continue, and that's happened right into the most recent decades, and that people are not comfortable talking about sex, and just people grow up ignorant, and can't tell you the many stories of how that much damage this does.
And that was pretty true with your generation. And
absolutely.
Is that true today? Have we grown? Have we grown beyond that? Those Puritan ideas about our sexuality? And are we more open?
I think the answer is both yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes. The younger generation, especially, they're much more comfortable about talking about sex and about having more sex, too, before they're married. I mean, I think a lot of things changed with the advent of the pill and people not feeling that it was safe to have sex, that they wouldn't get pregnant. So things are different, and they are communicating more, but they still... it's still an issue. As I said, still many couples don't talk about sex, that people don't tell people what they want, and it's still an issue, and we still have a long way to go. So it's good to bring some light today to this topic.
Yeah, and one of my questions, that will lead us down this path to unravel this a little bit is it really normal to be interested in sex as an older person? Because I can only imagine that many older people may not be interested, or that there's a lot of guilt complex, or there's all kinds of interesting dynamics with the children of their parents. When one spouse has died, like the situation that you're in, and sometimes it's hard for even the children to look at their parents and say, "You're moving on and having another sexual partner." Really?
Right. Well,
yeah. And those are all kinds of stigmas. How do you overcome those?
Right. I think that question about is it normal? And I personally, to have sex on your mind when you're over 65. I think, first of all, as a psychologist and a psychotherapist, my first part of my answer to that is, none of us are normal. There is no normal. There's just like all kinds of behaviors within the human comedy, the human condition, all kinds of sexual behaviors. And, if you're happy with it and as a couple, you're happy with it, that's just fine. But the real underlying question about is it normal to? Of course, it's sex is part of the being human. We're wired to be sexual, and someone has said, and I think it sums it up really nicely: is sex never disappears; it just changes its forms. And I think so. So sex is different on the whole, mostly in people over 65 than it was when they were 20, but it's present. I think people do have in our culture these ideas that if a man who's 75 were to express his sexuality, people are very quick to call him a dirty old man or lecherous, and that women have written about how they feel the societal expectations that when they're over 60, maybe that they should quietly turn their attention to their grandchildren and retreat into some kind of serene sexlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a shame, because people are sexual. They just still, people get turned on. They want to care about touching, and so there's a lot of hurt and loneliness that because of this cultural attitude.
Yeah, and let's define sex a little bit, because I think that's important. We often think of, when we say the word sex, we think of orgasm, we think of intercourse, but there's many other pieces that are associated with sex. Am I going down the right track there?
Right. I think, sex is being sexual, aware of, sexual attractions. And, there's many ways of being sexual other than beyond it, or including intercourse. So that I think, it's all about relationship. And that's what I think when we sort of learn about sexuality as we go through the ages of life, that it is less about performance, orgasm, and more about relationship and intimacy and closeness and affection. And so the balance shifts. But the shame continues. The paper today, the New York Times, had an article about how even the language in our culture is a shaming one about sex, and how some of the words that doctors use have built into them this concept of shame. This word pudendum, which is not very common, but it is, doctors talk about having those operations. That's a word for all the genital area and in a woman, and when it translates from the Latin, it means the shame of the shameful parts. And I think so. Anyway, that we have that double heritage of sex being glorified as the kind of the most important thing in life, to find a sexual partner, and also that the process of sex itself is kind of dirty and shameful. We talk about dirty jokes; those are jokes about sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those norms are, I think they're changing. I remember growing up as a kid, there were the books, the bathroom dirty jokes, that people would put in their bathroom. Nobody ever talked about it, but you would find those books in the bathrooms, which is kind of odd and weird, but that's usually where it was relegated.
Yep. Sex, then we kind of see it continues in many forms and at every age. And I'm struck, of several examples of that I've always thought about, that just kind of are sort of models of that the subject is taboo, and yet it continues for most people, or many people. The poet, or the painter, the artist, Georgia O'Keeffe, was a kind of a revolutionary artist, but she was also lived a kind of life that was free for her time. And what struck me was when I learned that when she was 95, she had a 37-year-old young man as a lover. And I think that so there are all these examples of people that have broken the boundaries, but for the most of us, it goes at a slower pace.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. Let's talk about some of the stereotypes about older people who are interested in sex. What are some of those stereotypes?
Well, the stereotypes is that that sex is only for the young and beautiful, and I think that is one of the most damning, because it sort of says you shouldn't be. Kind of the implicit message is, if you're older and not beautiful, forget about sex. That it is also, as I said, in the language of dirty old man, it's dirty, and so people hide it and they pretend they aren't, and so that and I think that for women, it's never been allowable for women to be sexual. We see that in some of the other cultures around the world where women are expected to cover themselves up so that they won't, and to be modest. It means you have to put on hoods and just have your eyes put out, just little places to look out, and that is so that you won't, no men will get aroused. But meanwhile, the women are in these hot countries all veiled up and hooded. It's kind of shocking. So it makes us, I think, most American women glad that they're not living in one of those countries where women.
It's interesting. I've often wondered, okay, well, if it's good for the woman, why aren't the men running around in their veils and hooded garments as well? There's people that can be turned on by a man, so...
but they don't see it that way. They just see it.
It's convenient.
All the woman's fault. Even the Christian faith goes back to it's all because Eve ate that apple. It's Eve's fault. So that we have a lot of kind of misogyny built into our sexual habits and the way we talk about sex.
Yeah. What are some of the other stereotypes that?
Well, I think that women, men have to be the aggressor, and that's one that is. That women again feel ashamed if they to be the aggressor. They have the feeling they were, at least when I was growing up, as women, girls, you had to wait for the men, and that I think continues to.
I would agree with that. Definitely agree with that. From a man's perspective.
And so that the whole idea that you have to be passive, and then the other stereotype is that I think that in what I hear as a therapist, that the men know very little that they in terms of the men of the older men. In terms of the actual anatomy because they haven't talked about it. But so it's a stereotype that they're kind of clumsy lovers, and they all say go to Italy and find somebody because our culture has where we've made sex a taboo. It means that people are pretty ignorant about kind of some of the basics.
Yeah. Is that? Do you think that's a stereotype as well? Are Europeans better lovers than us, our American counterparts?
Well, I think certainly younger men are better, more informed, and I think certain cultures where they're more emotional. You see, I think that sex is about emotions and feeling, and people that are able to express their feelings, which our culture, you get certain cultures that where people are not articulate about feelings. They might feel strongly inside, but they can't express it. So I think it's more than a stereotype, and there's truth to it, that people vary greatly in terms of, and that I wouldn't say, and many Americans are, not what we would call movie star lovers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in general we're still pretty uptight about sex, but we're moving in the right direction. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely.
Yeah. In your walks as an 87-year-old, how active are seniors really in their sexuality?
Well, I've done some research on that, and it turns out that, of course, on the whole, they're less active. Of the population over 70s. That's about 29% of the men are sexually active and 25% of the women, meaning in this case actually having sexual intercourse. And so that is far fewer than like a generation that was 20s or 30s. And I think that's partly because many men are unable to get an erection, and despite Viagra, I think people give up on the actual intercourse, but that doesn't mean they're not active in some of these ways we were talking about before, of being connected to somebody, having a relationship, being affectionate, having sexual activities like kind of holding each other and kissing and all the other ways that you can be sexual beside intercourse.
Yeah,
I've kind of seen it in my practice and in my research that seniors kind of fall into four different groups. That there are some people that are truly not interested. I think I've had people say to me, well, nobody's interested in sex after, and they kind of think because they're not interested that nobody else is. So that's a sizable group that is not sexually active and not sexually interested. But and then there's a lot of people that are connected to their sexual feelings, but they don't have a partner when they're older. That's because people die, and people get divorced, people are alone, and people are never, so that they are interested but no partner. Then there are people that are interested but may have physical problems. I mean, diabetes and erectile problems, so that they don't. They're interested but unable to actually have intercourse. They can still be sexual, but they can't actually have sexual intercourse.
Yeah.
And then there's a group of that like at least more than 25%, people that are interested in sex and active. The couples that are very, whether they actually have intercourse or not, they're actually sexual together and fond of each other and kind of do all kinds of things that each, it's unique. And I think that's more. It turns out there's a study that recently came out that says that women over 80 who have sexual partners or have a partner they express the highest rate of sexual satisfaction of any group of people in their 80s. Were more satisfied than people in their 70s and their 60s and their 50s. So, and I think being in my 80s myself and having a partner, I think part of it is that there's such a special appreciation and gratitude when you're in your 80s and you do have a partner and you do find a new love. It just seems so special and just as much a miracle as when you're 20 and find someone, because when you're 80, it's if you're honest, it's kind of slim pickings, and the number of people you meet, and to find someone that and suddenly fall in love again is just a kind of a little miracle.
Yeah, but it does happen. I've seen it. The independent living communities, a lot of our long-term care communities are a great place for people to meet and discuss all of these. Yeah.
And I think, even people that have more moderate or even fairly advanced dementia fall in love. I remember the kind of shocking story about when Sandra Day O'Connor, the Supreme Court judge, her husband had dementia, and he was in a memory unit, and so she would go to visit him, and then it turned out that he had sort of fallen in love with a woman in the memory unit, and they would be sitting there holding hands, and he had found kind of love that and the two of them would sit there, and instead of being horrified or angry, she realized that was all part of life, and that so she was sort of let it go, and she wrote about it, and I think it was like one of the many sort of incremental steps of letting us make our peace with what's real. And here that was real. He didn't know that, he kind of sometimes didn't even recognize her, but that even when you're, quite disabled, there's still that spark of love and sex that, and there they sat holding hands. So that was always a kind of touching story, I thought.
Yeah. And talk a little about quality versus quantity. Does that change as you go into your older years?
Oh, I think absolutely. Well, quantity of certainly, there's not the sort of cowboy sex of people having sex 2 or 3 times in a day. I think that doesn't happen. I think there's certainly less sex. There's also when I was doing my interviews and I was out in California, this one guy was saying, certain things don't change. He said people don't talk about sex, but they make jokes about Viagra, which is kind of interesting. And but they do. So they don't talk about it, but they it's still sort of swept under the rug.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, the how people change. I would think that everything that you've alluded to so far, that quality supersedes the quantity, and it's
No, that's
less
a perfect,
less
perfect,
less.
perfect way to say it.
Yeah.
That quality begins to matter. And someone, when I was at that, I was just forgotten to finish the end of that story, which was in California. This guy that was telling me about the Viagra jokes that circulated. He also said to me, there are very few one-night stands among the older set. I mean, and it's people don't have that kind of hooking up or.
Yeah.
And so that people, it's always much more relationship based on the whole. Yeah.
Yeah, and which kind of leads me to the next question that I have, and that is, how is sex in the 70-plus generation different from sex of the younger people? And we've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but kind of go into a little bit deeper.
Well, I do think that it's all about intimacy, and I have found that younger couples, when they say we are intimate, that is their language for saying we've had sexual intercourse.
Mm-hmm.
But when older couples talk about intimacy, they're meaning the closeness and the relationship that has a sexual component, but it may not have intercourse in it, so that they even use the language differently. So that word intimacy changes, but it becomes prime and primary for I think that for older couples. So there's a lot of satisfaction in older couples, especially 65 to 95.
Yeah.
But the differences are, those generations grew up and have started their sexual life before the pill, and that was like such a watershed that they grew up where the church played more of a role, and so people were less experienced. They had less know-how, and also. It was before the internet, and I think the sexual experience, especially of younger folks, very sadly today is so contaminated by all the porn. I mean, the porn is just everywhere, and people are saying, people that are experts in youth and sex assume that every young male has watched hours of porn, and that kind of distorts what their experience with real people is going to be. So I think that our generation, the older people, are at least, there may be some porn that is watched, but it's nothing like what's going on today.
Yeah.
So I think, and much of what goes on is the same as, I think there's a lot about sex that hasn't changed in the last 50 years. I mean, the issues of intimacy, communication are still important, and that's what couples still come in. Couples, when they come in, they are less apt. They sometimes go to a counselor around the issues of sex, but they usually come in and say we have communication problems, and that seems to be paramount throughout all generations.
I have a question in regards to controlled sex versus freer sex. When you're in your 70 plus, or let's say you're below, you're in that the 20s and up crowd, and especially from your generation, my stereotype is for that generation is that people just didn't have the freedom to express really what they wanted, even amongst their partners. And do you find that in the 70-plus crowd that you're more relaxed with your sexual nuances, your positions, and things like that, that you're more open to try new things as opposed to, because there's a lot of things going on in your generation, being more religious, more spiritual, that were kind of lids that shaped some of the values or the, forced women, especially women, to be more controlled, more, what's the word I'm looking for? Conservative.
Or conservative, sure. I think people did not, often got married so young because they, the minute if you really got turned on or aroused, then people wanted to get married because the girls wouldn't, many of them wouldn't give in and have sex until they got at least the ring, and but got married. So I think that but I think. In my experience and from the couples that I've counseled, that it's not so much being adventuresome in the sex; it's being affectionate in the sex and having it's more kind of the ability to say that somebody, young people just struggle over saying they love somebody. They talk, they struggle over when they can say they're dating. I mean, they kind of have a big thing. Well, are we dating? Or are we boyfriend and girlfriend? And each of these steps is just agonizing for them to do. I think older people are more able to connect, and they might not be much more articulate, but there's a kind of a feeling comfort and not caring what people think. I think one of the freedoms that comes, I think, when you're older is, when you're young, if you have a little pimple on your cheek, you might stay in your room and not go out to a party. By the time you're my age, you kind of, everyone here at my retirement community is getting these have bandages on their faces for where they're getting different things removed, precancerous things. And there's a freedom where people accept that, and they don't feel they have to be beautiful to have sex or to be sexual, and so that there's a freedom of not caring what people think or not thinking about what other people would think. They just are able to be. So it's a freedom that comes. But people, of course, each couple has sex in their own way, and some people, talk baby talk, and some people do a lot of patting, and there's all kinds of ways of being affectionate. Some people take showers. There's tons of ways people express it.
Yeah. I really resonated with the way you just expressed the differences when we are younger in our sexuality, and I love that term, more adventurous. I think that's probably accurate. And then as we age and grow older, our sexuality grows and changes, and it becomes deeper and more intimate. So it's not as adventurous, but it's more intimate. And I'm assuming that with that comes the quality of, it's not, I want to say the quality of the sex, it's the quality of the relationship. And sex is just one of those vehicles. Is that also a good way to say that?
Oh, and I think that's a perfect way of saying it. I mean, it's the quality of the relationship. And then what I found out in my own story of the last, since I became a widow, was that you can make all the same, you have all the same challenges in a relationship, that the challenges don't change. I have, about a year after I became a widow, and I was very lonely, and an old classmate from my grammar school called up, and he wanted, he and his another friend wanted to have lunch with me. So I had lunch with this guy named Michael. He had been in my grade from first to sixth grade. Then I'd moved away. But I had never forgotten Michael, because he had once told me that he liked me in fourth grade, and that was the first person that ever made a declaration of love. He just said, "I like you." And so I had always had this warm spot in my heart for him. I hadn't seen him. I had moved away at age 11. I came back, or he came back into my life when we were both 83. I mean, this was many years later. And he was a psychologist, and I'd known him. He was an old, he'd been my first person that had made a loving declaration, and we started to be together. I would go visit him, but then after a few weeks and months, I realized he wanted someone to move in. I didn't, and I was finding at the same time that I didn't really enjoy being with him. That he wasn't much of a talker. I didn't feel we had much to say to each other, and I was trying to get out of it, and the idea of giving up. It was nice to have a boyfriend, but I didn't want to be there. So we broke up, and I realized that I had all the same issues that so many people feel when they're in a relationship that isn't working, and I just wanted to leave every time I was with him. I couldn't wait to get away. So that was like a sad realization that the quality does matter, and the fact that he was a psychologist, that wasn't enough to make it a good relationship.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the story goes on, because I had just said to you, I'm with somebody about a year. Well, I had been in a support group for people who had lost their spouse, and I would be crying. There was this guy in that group named Peter, and all of us that would in the support group would cry, and we'd talk about losing our spouses, and his spouse had dementia, and she was not doing well, and my husband was failing. And then, that's how I knew him, and he sort of knew me very well. We'd been in the support group about 3 years. And and then finally it sort of turned pivoted in a dime. I had kind of looked at him. I never thought of him in a romantic light at all. And then there was a dance here at my retirement community. And now he was on a walker, so we couldn't really dance, but we stood up and kind of swayed, and suddenly, it turned, there was sort of a sexual component to it that hadn't been there, because first of all, we'd always been sitting down, and it was just somehow the standing and swaying and him holding me, I was sort of stirred up all that touching, the need for closeness, and I already was close to him emotionally, and so we started having dinner together, and then the next thing we knew, we were kind of a couple. It was kind of funny that the minute we stood up and danced at that dance, the next day, two different people called me up, and said, "Could we have dinner?" They assumed we were a couple, just seeing us once dance. So that sort of shows you something about retirement communities. They're watching for new romances.
Yes, lots of eyes.
Everybody loves the idea of a new couple. I mean, they all got pleasure, and then people still do. They say, "I'm so happy you two found each other." And there was another funny part to my story too, that we were when the pandemic came. Peter has the apartment about 5 flights above mine, and I'm down. I'm 205. He's 605, and so it's just an elevator between us. And we were running back and forth. Sometimes we spent time in his, sometimes in mine. But when the pandemic came and we were being locked up, so to speak, in our apartments, the administration here said, "Well, we don't want you guys going back and forth like that in the elevators and so on. You've got to be in one place or the other." So Peter and I had our first crisis, which was whose apartment, your place or mine. And both of us liked our place. He had all his stuff, and I was at that point writing the book and needed my computer, which is a desktop. So I won out on the place, and he moved down to my place. And we quickly, as the pandemic, they were closing us up. Brought down his clothes, and we've been living together ever since.
Now, do you have children, Katherine?
I do. I have.
And does he have children? And then how did the children respond to you two shacking up, if you will?
Yeah, well, I have 4 sons, and they're all married, and he has 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. We were lucky. They were all. I think my sons were thrilled because they knew I was not lonely during the pandemic. Yeah. But I have to say that many of the other couples here at my place don't have that. Many of my clients too that I worked with, it's a different story. That it's almost many of the new couples find that one of their children just can't get with it, and they are very upset. They feel that they can't believe their parent, either their father or their mother, is kind of disloyal to the marriage, and they're kind of one of my clients was, very angry, worried about the other woman that his father was now seeing. He was in they keep thinking that they're trying to get their money, and a lot of it, which is sort of shocking, is about worry about money. But they're also worried about they don't like to think their parents are at all sexual. I mean, I think that's kind of, and I think no children actually like to think about their parents being sexual. That's kind of a universal thing.
Yeah.
Very hard to accept. So better, and they don't want any information.
Sure.
But any facts. But I think it is a problem for, these new loves that people have, like myself.
Yeah. But when you look at the bigger picture, and this is about, we're not designed, I keep going back to the biblical model, and the biblical model is when, God created Adam and Eve, and it's not good for man to be alone. That goes both ways. It's not good for us to be alone. So that's why he created the helpmate. Yeah.
Yeah, people, I think, not, and of course there are people that do fine being alone, and then of course we haven't talked about, there's lots of gay people that want to be not with a partner of the opposite sex, but one of the own sex. But I think, one of the things we learned was the terrible price of social isolation and loneliness during the pandemic. We found that, not having a partner, being lonely, or being isolated is so terrible for your health that you have a 30% higher risk of just dying. And, loneliness, people have realized over the last 5 years that it's a national problem. And it was a problem in Great Britain, too. They were the first ones appointed a minister of loneliness. And that person was, kind of helping people deal with their loneliness, which is really, then loneliness is different from just being alone, because you can be alone and not lonely if you kind of have connections and feel okay. But loneliness is when you feel you're not with people that kind of get you and that you love and kind of understand you. So we've learned that, I think, in the last 3 years, 18 months of this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we really need, we are social animals. We need to be with other people, and we also, most of us are happiest when we have a partner. Not everybody, but many, the majority.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a little bit about the benefits of being sexually active, and I think we've already touched on some of those right there. There's some benefits, not being alone.
Right, there's not being alone. It's good for your health. They find out that people are healthier that are parts of couples.
Isn't sex considered the lubrication of our bodies?
Well, it's good for you.
That's what I read.
Your health.
Yeah. See, I really believe that when you are having sex, you're releasing all kinds of endorphins and all kinds of chemicals throughout your body, that's what I mean by the lubrication. Is that it's doing things inside of our bodies that are keeping us and rejuvenating cell structures, and on it goes.
Right, and it absolutely, in terms of the hormones and kind of oxytocin and things like that, the natural, so that it's good for the health, it's good for well-being, and I think also people that are involved with a partner and where there's some sexual stuff going on, it's good for your self-esteem. I think people that are in partners are unexpectedly happy. They're happy, and so it is definitely good for your health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really agree with that, and it's sad that some people, whether they have to give that up or no fault of their own, their bodies are just not working and functioning the way they used to, and which leads me to another discussion, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit, and that is health problems or disabilities and how that impacts. You talked a little bit about dementia, which is very common amongst our aging population,
Yes,
and then that impact. But I was fascinated that you knew of a person that had, or that you told the story of Sandra Day O'Connor, where her husband with his dementia, and I'm sure there are many other stories like that out there.
yeah. So I think that definitely so say that question again. What did you ask, Mark? I lost.
I was alluding to the fact of health problems, and that
Health problems.
that's not it can be a barrier, but some of that can be overcome. And I was fascinated by the story of Sandra Day O'Connor, and there may be many other stories out there like that where intimacy is just how we're hardwired.
And I think, what I was trying to say, and then I lost my train of thought at that minute, but, a lot of people with, say, diabetes can't get an erection, and I've heard a number of people told me stories of how they tried Viagra, and it didn't work, and the men were so upset, and there was such a loss of pride that they just stopped having any sexual activity altogether. And that's the tragedy, because it's not the disability, it's what, the opposite of shame is, and the other thing that we need to take into account is pride. And people feel badly, they feel like if they can't get an erection, the guy often feels so much shame that they just stop all kind of activity. And so what is a better approach is to learn how to talk about it. And if people can talk about it, then that you can see that some of these things can be overcome, or you can have some other kinds of sexual activity. And that's what is the challenge, is to help people learn how to talk about it, and that is still difficult.
Yeah, and there's so many other ways that you can express your sexuality than through an erection. And,
right, exactly.
And that's a hard conversation for maybe your generation to have that conversation than maybe some of the younger generation, where they're a little more open-minded and able to express those things easier. Is that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think they've talked about sex more. They're more comfortable with the words.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's the older generation. It's hard, and that is one of the challenges to deal with communication problems. But it's also one of the fixes, that you don't have to be. It's not an either or. You're having intercourse or not doing anything. That's what is the message that needs to get across. Yeah.
Well, there's masturbation. There's lots of ways that you can express yourself sexually without intercourse, so to speak, or having an erection. There's still many ways.
And I think, but I think among women in my generation, like masturbation, there's a lot of women that masturbated, and we'll talk about it. It was very calm about it. I think what happens in my generation, there's such a continuum of awareness and comfort, but there's many people, women, who have not only in my generation, not only never masturbated, but never have said the word out loud. So we get all kinds of. But I think there are fewer of those in younger people. They're more comfortable with.
And that's where the layers of shame and guilt and judgment that your generation has had to suffer through, the younger generations are peeling off. And hopefully it'll be interesting to see how my generation and the generations younger than me, I'm 63, so it'll be interesting to see how we age 20 years from now. And then the people that are in their 40s today, how they'll be 40 years from now, and the freedoms and how they approach this whole topic of their sexuality in their 80s as well.
It will be. And I'll just put in one other note, plugging for my generation, which is that the olders, the people that are like in their late 70s and their 80s, grew up with in the wake of World War II, and we knew that things could change, and we'd all they'd even heard stories, or I lived through as an 87-year-old World War II, where we didn't have any gasoline and didn't have this, didn't have that. So things like when the pandemic came along, I think the older generations panicked less than the people in their 50s and 60s, and were less anxious because we had seen the world go through these traumas and were resilient. And I think some people, had always, the boomers, many of them had always were kind of never had the hardships. And we just, my generation took it for granted that was part of life, that you don't get everything.
Yeah,
so that's interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting. So let's kind of shift gears here a little bit, and I want to know from your perspective at 87, where do people over 65 find new partners?
Well, I think there's. It seems to me there's some clear patterns. That one of them is my story is kind of typical of people that you went to school with back when, and people go to reunions when they go to their high school reunions, when they go to their college reunions, and they very often people find a new partner there. But of course, the new way to do it is to go to the online, and there's these all different websites for older people. There's Our Time, but the number one site used to be Silver Singles, but it's now eHarmony. And of course, there's horror stories about people. People lying to each other, people adding 4 inches and subtracting 15 years from their profiles.
I think that happens amongst the young people as well on all the websites. It's a great place to hide.
This is a way to meet people, and lots of people have met people. And I think it's once you understand how it's so good for your health to be with other people, it's even to, you may just find somebody to go to the movies with when we can go to the movies, but just talk on the phone with, I think. But many of them do find new partners by going to these match places, and I think the others may find them in their own town, like, or people in my retirement community find each other. There's sort of when new people come in, you can just sort of, as I sort of indicated, people are watching and getting pleasure when they see these new romances. But of course, the statistics are there 5/8 of the people are women, so there are fewer men to go around. So men, I think, get a little. They have a lot of people to pick from, and you can sort of see what happens when a new single man that's interested. Some men aren't interested at all, but when the new man that is interested, they'll take one person to have dinner with. They'll be having different people for dinner, and then you see them settling in with one.
Yeah.
And and I think that all these a lot of towns have council on agings, but people meet whenever there's a common activity. Volunteering at the soup kitchen. Working on a political campaign. Anytime you meet people, you're going to meet some new people. But I think it is also some people, as I said, are really open and they'll find somebody, and some people that are not really open aren't looking, and then they don't find anybody.
Yeah, you've mentioned before, I think in our last conversation that we had, and this time I want to ask how the Japanese art of kintsugi, how does that fit into our conversation today about sex?
Yeah, well, I think that, our culture, as I've said, has been so harsh on saying that you have kind of telling us in many ways through the advertising that sex is only for the young and beautiful. But the Japanese have this art, and I think it's relevant. I often talk about this when I'm speaking, is this art called kintsugi, which is the art of taking broken bits of pottery, if it's like a bowl that's broken, and they'll repair it by putting in a golden lacquer so that you end up with a bowl reconstructed, but with these veins of gold running through it. and they claim and feel that this broken pottery that's now repaired is more beautiful than the original so-called perfect bowl that existed before, and that they see the beauty in the kind of repaired pot. And I think, to me, that's the way I now look at older people, that we all have, with modern medicine, we have new hips and new knees and new eyes with cataract, and we have hearing aids, and we have all pacemakers and operations, and we are put together, and we now have this privilege of aging, which has never been before for so many people, and that we should be looking at each other and seeing the beauty in being these, it's kind of like the broken pottery that we're put together, and it's golden lacquered to this ability, and that we've been able to survive all these long years and to flourish. And if you look carefully at the faces of people in their 70s and 80s, there's such a beauty in and it's like a amazing ability to be flourishing and as I say, what a privilege too. There's a verse from a Leonard Cohen song. He's the one that did the Hallelujah thing, and I think it's a whole perspective that about how to enjoy life and age well, and especially in terms of our topic today, sex. He says, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget the perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in." And sort of that it's not the perfection, but it's just focusing on what we still have, and there's so many more possibilities that exist. And rather than looking at what we've lost and what is we have to give up, and it's so important to focus on what exists.
That is well said, and maybe that's a really good place for us to end our conversation. I mean, I can't see any better way to end it than right there.
Yeah, I think that's fine, and I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think we've explored a number of facets. There's still more, but I think we've covered a great deal. I really appreciate you having this forum, and we need to get out the word about the new way of aging, and that sex in the seniors is a whole topic that is happening in new ways, then we should learn about them.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for having this, Mark.
Oh, yeah. And then, Katherine, I want our listening audience to know that you're not only a fabulous speaker, and you're speaking the language, you're living the language at 87 years young, and you've also written a book. Tell our listening audience about your book, because many of these topics that we continue to talk about are in your book.
Yeah, so my book that I wrote is called 80-somethings, and it's the subtitle suggests it as a practical guide to letting go, aging well, and finding unexpected happiness. And I interviewed 128 people, and the book is kind of like a primer for aging well. It delves into some of the transitions and the challenges, and I think that for most people, as they age, there's lots that's puzzling, and they're bewildered. And not only are they kind of bewildered, but their children, the adult children. And this book kind of goes into a number of topics, love and sex and friendship and grandchildren and letting go and the shrinking world. It's got many topics of real focus, interest to older people. But it also it sort of sheds a light on what old age is really like for the younger generation. So it's a book that I think feel very good about having written it, and hope that it opens doors for all kinds of people.
Yeah, and I highly encourage our listening audience to pick up a copy of Dr. Katherine Esty's book, 80-something. That's the correct title. Is that right, Dr.?
80-somethings.
Yep. 80-somethings with a plural. Gotcha.
Yeah.
And it's a key. There's it's chock full of wisdom. It's chock full of life. It's addressing all the questions that we have towards the aging process. And you devoted some time to the sex life, right? Sex after 80?
Right. Yep. It's in there, and love and sex, and kind of looking at some of this idea of intimacy too, and but there's lots of other things about that. Some of the challenges, there's something on dementia. There's something on grandparenting, caregiving. That's such a topic for older people. That looking at how time changes. One of the things that changes is the perspective on time. When you are my age, you kind of only think about your future's smaller. But I've also learned that your past, you rewrite your story, and you kind of there's some interesting ways that people, as they get older, have fewer regrets. So there's a chapter on holding on and letting go. There's a chapter on survival skills, especially how people that are at the lower end of the economics, how they survive, and something on spirituality. And then, the only other subject beside sex that is hard for people to talk about is death, and and there's a chapter on approaching death and how we are reluctant. We often can't say people have died. People say we passed. And so that's a chapter. And in every chapter, there's some conversation starters and some tips for families. So it's really a primer for people, both the adult children that may have parents that are in their late 70s or 80s, and also for people as they get into that last looking back. And I also present a new vision for old age.
All right. Well, what a delight you are. And I definitely want you to come back onto our program, Aging Today, and we'll have another conversation in the future. Is that okay if we invite you back? That
would be good. I think you're a very good interviewer, I want to say, so it makes it very easy and very fun to be on this program.
Well, thank you. So. Well, and you're just the wisdom that you exude from your voice is just amazing, and I've learned so much from you, and I appreciate you, especially on this topic, to be open, transparent, and to talk about something that is hard to talk about for many, many people. And maybe this conversation will embolden other people to have this conversation amongst themselves wherever you are.
Good. I hope so. I really do.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Katherine Esty. And
okay. And goodbye for now.
All right. And I also want to thank our show sponsor, Comfort Care Home Care of West Lynn, Oregon. The Comfort Care team at West Lynn is devoted to assisting you to live your best life possible. This is Mark Turnbull, your host. Thank you for tuning in to Aging Today, the podcast where together we explore the many options to aging on your terms. Join us again next week for another live discussion on Aging Today. And remember, we're all in the process of aging. And as we age, we really are better together. So stay young at heart.